It was my first night shift job, and I was excited yet nervous at the same time. I was hired as a security guard at a supposedly abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. My job was to do regular rounds and make sure everything was in order. As I walked through the dimly lit corridors, I couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was watching me. Every little sound made me jump, and I was constantly checking my surroundings. But the worst was yet to come. As I was making my rounds, I heard a faint whisper coming from one of the rooms. I froze in my tracks and strained my ears to listen. It was definitely a voice, but I couldn't make out what it was saying. I cautiously approached the room, but as I got closer, the whispering stopped. I shrugged it off as my imagination and continued with my rounds. But as the night progressed, I heard more and more strange noises. Footsteps, doors creaking, and even laughter. The more I heard, the more my anxiety grew. As I was passing by a particularly dark corner, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I turned to face it, but there was nothing there. I shook my head and tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But deep down I knew something was off. Finally, as my shift was coming to an end, I heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the main hall. I ran towards it, but as I got closer I realized that the source of the scream was coming from the room where I'd heard the whispering earlier. I hesitated for a moment, but then I mustered up the courage to go in. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. There was a figure in the corner of the room, hunched over and covered in blood. Its eyes were glowing in the dark, and it was staring right at me. I ran out of the room as fast as I could and called the police. To this day, I don't know what happened in that warehouse, or who or what that figure was. But one thing is for sure, I will never forget my first night shift job. I awoke from my slumber to see my girlfriend by my side, as expected. I guess I had a nightmare. It was something about car crashes and death. I got nightmares often, but sometimes they were just so bad. I wrapped my arms around her and held her tight. She inched her body against mine, and I lay there, basking in the warmth her small body gave off. We'd been together for 4 years now. I loved every moment of it. Whether we were hiking and camping, or just spending time at home, there was never a dull moment. She had this way of always making me smile, always knowing exactly what to say or how to act to make me feel better. She was perfect for me, and I was so excited to propose. I had this elaborate proposal plan and everything. As I brought my arm up her body, from her stomach to her breasts, and slowly towards her hair, I felt something cold. It felt liquid, and it was running down her neck. I assumed it was drool or maybe sweat, since it was pretty hot in our room, so I grabbed a small blanket and wiped it off. I put the blanket back, but paused. It was blood. I jolted awake and jumped out of bed. I flicked on the light and saw that there was blood pooling from her mouth to the carpet. I began to tear up and tried to shake her awake, but had no response. I sobbed and buried my face into her chest, looking for a pulse of some kind, but there was nothing. It had to have been at least 5 minutes until I realized my stupidity and got up to phone the paramedics. When I tried to leave, her arm shot up and pulled me back with more strength than I expected of her. I froze and looked at her face. Her eyes had opened, and what was under those eyelids was solid black. I could see my horrified face in the reflection as she gripped her cold hands around my neck. I tried to scream for help, but there was no use. A twisted smile formed at her mouth as she pulled me in closer and closer. I shook in fear as I remembered something. My girlfriend works the night shift now. I'd recently started working nights at a 24-hour Target store. My city isn't small, but it's not huge either, so only a few customers came in during those wee hours of the morning. That meant that I was able to focus on getting freight on the shelves and doing the cleaning jobs that the day shift didn't have time for. It was actually a pretty easy-going job, until it wasn't. I should preface this by saying some people who work in retail have a serious attitude problem when it comes to poor people, and that always bothered me. There's a general lack of compassion in society. I don't want you to think that this is just me being afraid of someone just because he smelled bad and had raggedy clothes. People I love very much once struggled with mental health issues and homelessness, and I was raised not to judge people for things like that. Anyway, one night this guy walked in a little after midnight. His clothes clung to his bony frame, and he legitimately looked like an extra from a zombie movie. His sunken eye sockets were the familiar visage of someone struggling with poverty and addiction, and the sight of him made my heart hurt a little. But the moment I greeted him, a sinister smile twisted his lips. I shifted my weight, crossing my arms over my chest as his gaze drifted down my frame. I should probably mention that I was 17 at the time, but always looked young for my age. He told me I was pretty, and then let out a nervous laugh that sent chills down my spine. I kept an eye on him from a distance, watching him wander up and down the aisles and talk to himself. From that night on, he became a regular. Every midnight, he'd come in to wander the aisles, not buying anything, just murmuring to himself and occasionally laughing. While it was odd that he spent a lot of time in the toy section and the children's clothing area, he never stole anything. And he didn't cause any real trouble, so I let him be. Here's where things get weird. On my 18th birthday, he came up to my counter holding an old toy robot, a model we didn't carry in our store. As he handed it to me, his cold, bony fingers brushed against mine, and I tried not to recoil. His raspy voice made my skin crawl, as he said, "This is for the birthday girl." My heart was pounding. I felt like a mouse looking up at a big, smiling barn cat. Before you guys say anything, yes, I know I shouldn't have accepted it. I should have told him no thank you. But at that moment, I didn't want to upset him. So I just kind of smiled, said thanks, and when it was my turn to go on lunch, I took it to the break room where it stayed. It was an ongoing joke amongst my co-workers for the rest of the time I worked there. Ha freaking ha. Yes, I got a birthday present from creepy toy guy. Maybe he heard one of my co-workers say something about my birthday. They'd surprised me with cupcakes, and he may have noticed them planning it the day before. After that, I started noticing other weird little things. Things that could have been attributed to coincidence. For example, the fluorescent lights over the register would flicker whenever the man entered the store. Once he left, I could feel a noticeable chill in the air, even though there were no open windows or doors. I told my manager the guy had bad vibes, but said he was just a quirky, harmless old man. I felt like a jerk, being so on edge because of his appearance, but my gut told me something it was more than that. A long time later, I was watching a documentary on cold cases when I saw a sketch that bore an eerie resemblance to my late-night toy shopping friend. The suspect had been on surveillance footage, spending time browsing toys and children's clothes in a Target in Nebraska. Mind you, this was years earlier, in a different state. But 3 kids had gone missing, never to be found. Some part of me thought I might just be paranoid. My mum always told me I'd give myself nightmares watching true crime before bed. Still, I couldn't shake the thought in the back of my head that something wasn't right. Every shift, I dreaded midnight. and the arrival of the strange man who had a fascination with toys. The thought of him possibly having a dark past that he was never held accountable for was more than a little unsettling. One week I got the flu and called out sick for a couple of days. When I came back, I was still not feeling great. I didn't have the energy to deal with his weirdness. About 5 past midnight, the lights flickered, the automatic doors opened, and in strolled creepy toy guy, with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. His eyes fixed on me instantly, but this time he didn't smile. "Where the fuck have you been?" The crusty corners of his mouth were pulled down into a deep frown. "I was sick." I shrugged, disinterested in carrying on a conversation. He scoffed. "I've been sick my whole life." Shaking his head, he headed straight for the toy aisle. I blinked with a deadpan stare as I watched him turn the corner. "Cool," I murmured and continued sweeping. A few minutes later, a bunch of toys started making noise. Not a big deal. Some of them have motion sensors that will go off as you walk past. The part that weirded me out was that they all started at once. I'm talking trucks beeping on one aisle and baby dolls crying on another. After a good 5 minutes of non-stop chaotic noise, my shift leader asked me to go check on creepy toy guy. I know. My first thought was, screw that. Why don't you go check on him? But she got this desperate look on her face and said she needed to hurry and count out the drawers before the system updated. So I begrudgingly dragged my dust mop over toward the toy section. I took slow breaths as I rounded the corner, hoping he wasn't doing anything pervy. Peering around the corner, I found him holding one of those realistic-looking baby dolls, and gouging his grimy thumbnails into his eyes so hard the soft plastic was caving in. "Hey, bud." The words came out without me meaning to speak, and his head snapped up. He clenched his teeth in a grimace that slowly turned into a smile. "Little Rita had a bad day," he chuckled, holding up the doll by the top of its head so it was facing me. Reddish-brown smudges covered the doll's face. I guess his fingers must have been bleeding. My stomach rolled and I felt like I might throw up. Panic welling up in my chest, I told him that I was going home sick, and we'd have to close up the store for the night. He stared at me for a long minute, then nodded, placed the doll back on the shelf and left without a fuss. As soon as he was on the other side of those doors, I turned off the sensors and locked up so he couldn't come back in. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I made my way to the office. I told my manager that we had a biohazard to deal with due to the blood on the doll, and that I was feeling sick again and needed to go home. She threatened to write me up, but didn't. I hated leaving everyone short-handed because our freight crew was already understaffed, but I seriously felt like I was going to faint, and honestly they didn't pay me enough to deal with this crap. The next day I gave my 2-week notice and said I was no longer going to be available after 10 PM, effective immediately. Confident I'd never see the guy again, I also made a call to the hotline listed in the video I mentioned, telling them about what I saw and where they could look for their suspect. But I don't know if anyone ever followed up on it. On my last day, the toy robot was still standing on the microwave in the break room. And sometimes I wonder if it once belonged to some unfortunate kid he'd run into, somewhere between here and Nebraska.